They boiled a pot of water, wrapped the scorpion in a blanket, and attempted to throw it into the hot water. But the scorpion sprang out and stung both women. Immediately, they fell to the floor, their bodies racked with pain. In this gripping tale, marriage and loyalty are tested to their limits, and the outcome will shock you. Continue to watch to see how this story unfolds and the surprising twists that follow. In the lush, verdant hills of Hanover, Jamaica, there lived a woman named Ophelia. She was once known as the most loving and devoted wife in the small, tight-knit community of Cascade. Her marriage to Mike had started like a fairy tale, full of love and promise. But as the years went by, the story turned into a nightmare of betrayal, heartbreak, and despair. Mike, who had once been a hard-working and responsible man, had gradually succumbed to a wayward lifestyle. He became a frequent visitor to the rum shops and was often seen in the company of various women, the most notable of whom was Candice, a young and attractive woman from a nearby district. Mike's infidelity was no secret, and it was the talk of the community. He spent all his money on Candice and his other mistresses, while Ophelia and their children were left to fend for themselves. There were days when Mike would leave home for weeks on end, staying at Candice's house, while Ophelia and the children went hungry. She would plead with him to give her money for food, but he would chase her away, calling her names and blaming her for everything that was wrong in his life. The community watched with pity as Ophelia struggled to make ends meet, working minimal jobs to support her children. Years passed, and Ophelia's situation grew increasingly desperate. The weight of her husband's betrayal was a constant burden, but she persevered for the sake of her children. Then, one fateful year, a wave of sickness swept through the school her children attended. It was a deadly illness, one that claimed the lives of many children in the area. One by one, Ophelia's children fell ill. She did everything in her power to save them, spending all her savings on doctors and medicine. She even swallowed her pride and went to Mike, begging him to help her take the children to a good hospital. But Mike, cold and indifferent, told her he had no money and walked away, leaving her weeping in the street. Candice visited Ophelia one fateful day, her presence thick with disdain. Holding her nose and pointing at the meager surroundings, she sneered at the stench of death and poverty that clung to the air. Ophelia, her eyes filled with tears as she clung to her sick children, whispered with trembling resolve, "You will never know peace." Candice spat back, "Shut up, you fool. Don't blame me for your wrecked life." In a sudden burst of anger, Ophelia leaped from the bed where she had been keeping vigil, chasing Candice out of her home. As Candice ran through the yard, her mocking laughter echoed cruelly, leaving Ophelia seething with a mix of grief and rage. Ophelia was devastated. In the weeks that followed, her life became a nightmare as she watched, helplessly, while all her children succumbed to the illness, one after the other. The pain of losing her children was more than she could bear. She fell into a deep depression, her grief turning to anger and bitterness. She cursed Mike and his mistresses, especially Candice, vowing to avenge her children's deaths. After the death of her children, Ophelia was shattered. She had depleted all her savings trying to save them, and now, with their passing within days of each other, she didn't even have enough money to lay them to rest. Desperate, she went to their father, Mike, pleading for his help to give the children a proper burial since he had refused to assist while they were alive. But Mike cruelly refused, hurling harsh accusations at Ophelia, claiming she had a lover who fathered the children and that he was not responsible for them. He ordered her to seek help from the children's real father. As Ophelia wept, dropping to her knees, she insisted she had never cheated and that Mike knew those were his children, but he wouldn't listen. When she kept begging, Candice, annoyed by her presence, rushed up with a bucket of water and poured it over her. Drenched and humiliated, Ophelia stood up and turned away, vowing that this would be the last time they would see her begging for help. The community, aware of her suffering, rallied together with the church and held a fundraiser to help Ophelia lay her children to rest. After the funeral, Ophelia was no longer the timid, quiet woman she once was. She was cold and angry, her grief transforming into a burning bitterness. Consumed by her desire for revenge, Ophelia sought out an obeah man, a practitioner of dark magic. She paid him to cast a curse on Mike and his mistresses. The obeah man gave her some items and instructions on how to use them. That night, clad in black, Ophelia crept through the community under the cover of darkness and made her way to Candice's house. There, she sprinkled a black powdery substance at the door and in the shoes left outside. She then returned home, satisfied that she had set her plan in motion. For a while, everything seemed quiet. But months later, Candice announced that she was pregnant. Mike was overjoyed, and together, they made a mockery of Ophelia every time they passed her little shop. They boasted about their happiness, flaunting their relationship in front of the entire community. Ophelia wept in silence, but inside, she felt a dark satisfaction, knowing that their time would soon come. With their adulterous relationship was on full display, with Mike especially taking pleasure in reminding Ophelia that her deceased children were never his and that he was finally getting the family he always wanted. Each time, Ophelia would smile weakly, tears silently streaming down her cheeks as she tried to ignore their taunts and focus on her business. Despite the pain their words inflicted, she continued to persevere, her heart heavy with grief but resolute in her determination. 9 months later, it was time for Candice to give birth. Her labor was long and painful, lasting for hours. The midwives did their best to help her, but the baby did not come. It wasn't until the following day that Candice finally delivered, but what emerged was not a baby, but a large scorpion. The midwives screamed in horror and fled the room, leaving Candice and Mike alone with the creature. Mike, trying to understand what had happened, was stung by the scorpion and immediately began to convulse. Candice, in shock, screamed for help, and some neighbors rushed in to see what was happening. When they heard the story of what had transpired, they quickly left, not wanting to get involved in whatever curse had befallen the couple. Mike was eventually taken to the hospital, his body turning black as the poison from the scorpion's sting spread through him. Meanwhile, Candice was left alone with the scorpion, which refused to leave her side. The once proud and confident mistress now lived in fear, avoided by everyone in the community. People mocked her, calling her the mistress who delivered a scorpion. The stress and fear weighed heavily on Candice, but no matter how hard she tried, she could not rid herself of the creature. Candice's mother, Karen, heard about the dreadful fate that had befallen her daughter and immediately made plans to visit. Though she had always supported Candice in her manipulative schemes, the news of Candice giving birth to a scorpion sent chills down her spine. Karen knew this was no ordinary situation and felt a deep urgency to intervene. Determined to assess the situation herself, she prepared for the journey, ready to confront the dark reality that her daughter was now entangled in. Candice's mother, Karen, had lived much of her life as a mistress, and Candice was the product of one of those affairs. When Karen learned about her daughter's situation with Mike and Ophelia, she decided to visit, fully supporting Candice's actions. Having been a mistress herself, Karen knew the power of manipulation and control. She advised Candice to ensure she had full control over Mike's finances, stressing that securing her future was paramount. It was Karen who had first suggested spreading the vicious rumor that Ophelia's children weren't Mike's, planting the seeds of doubt and discord in Mike's mind. With a knowing smirk, Karen reminded Candice that a woman in their position had to be ruthless to survive, and she was proud to see her daughter following in her footsteps. Days later, Candice's mother arrives at her daughter's home. Seeing the dire state her daughter was in, with the scorpion following her every move, she advised Candice to get rid of the scorpion and leave the house. Now that Candice and Mike had been cursed with the birth of a scorpion, Karen saw the terrifying consequence of their actions. Realizing the gravity of the situation and fearing the dark fate that had befallen them, Karen decided it was time to intervene. She knew that remaining with Mike could only lead to further ruin. But she underestimated the dark curse that has plagued Candice's life. Without hesitation, Karen went to Candice and insisted they leave Mike behind to face his punishment alone. She reminded Candice that she needed to think of her own safety and future, urging her to cut ties with the man who had brought them to this cursed state. But first they needed to eliminate the scorpion in order to leave. Candice agreed as she was terrified of the scorpion watching her. They devised a plan and went to the kitchen to execute it. They boiled a pot of water, wrapped the scorpion in a blanket, and attempted to throw it into the hot water. But the scorpion sprang out and stung both women. Immediately, they fell to the floor, their bodies racked with pain. They died within minutes. Seconds after both women succumbed, the scorpion started to contort and shift into a newborn baby girl in her mother's arms. Their screams brought the neighbors rushing to the house. When they entered the kitchen, they found the lifeless bodies of Candice and her mother. But to their astonishment, lying on the floor between them was a newborn baby girl, wrapped in a blanket and crying. The authorities were called, and the baby was taken to the hospital for examination. She was found to be in perfect health. With Candice dead and Mike still in the hospital, the community was faced with the task of finding a relative to care for the baby. To everyone's surprise, Ophelia stepped forward to claim the child. As Mike's legal wife, she had the right to take the baby, and she informed the hospital that she would care for the child until a suitable relative could be found or until Mike recovered. Ophelia took the baby home and named her Sarah. Years passed, and Ophelia raised Sarah as her own, showering her with the love and care she had once given her biological children. But as Sarah grew older, she began to have nightmares, terrifying dreams of being bitten by a scorpion. Concerned, Ophelia returned to the Obeah man, seeking a solution. The Obeah man laughed at her, explaining that because of the curse she had used to transform the baby into a scorpion, the memories of that time would always haunt Sarah. The transformation had reverted after the curse had been fulfilled, but the fragments of the scorpion's memory lingered in Sarah's mind. Devastated by the knowledge that her actions had brought this upon Sarah, Ophelia cried out in despair. She couldn't bear to see Sarah suffer. The little girl had become like a daughter to her, and Ophelia's heart ached to see her in pain. In desperation, she went to the local church and prayed for forgiveness and guidance. As she poured out her heart in prayer, the pastor overheard her and approached her. Ophelia confessed everything to the pastor: the pain of losing her children, the bitterness that had led her to seek revenge, and the regret she now felt. The pastor listened carefully and then reassured her that no problem was too great for God. He asked her to bow her head, and he prayed over her and Sarah. He then gave Ophelia a bottle of consecrated olive oil and instructed her to anoint Sarah with it before bed, praying a specific prayer as she did so. That night, Ophelia followed the pastor's instructions. As she stayed awake in Sarah's room, she saw a shadowy figure of a scorpion appear, trying to possess the little girl. With trembling hands, Ophelia splashed some of the olive oil on the shadowy figure and began to rebuke it in the name of God. The scorpion let out a scream and disappeared into thin air. Sarah woke up from her nightmare, clinging to Ophelia in fear. Ophelia reassured her that everything was fine, giving her water to drink and holding her close until she fell back asleep. The next day, Ophelia took Sarah to see the pastor, who prayed over her again and declared her free from the curse. He also told Ophelia that if she sincerely asked for forgiveness from God, she would be forgiven. The pastor urged her to forgive Mike as well, who was still in the hospital, suffering the consequences of his actions. Ophelia agreed, admitting that she had already forgiven him long ago and no longer harbored any resentment. It was then that Ophelia decided to tell Sarah the truth, that she was not her biological mother, but her stepmother. Mike was her real father, and her biological mother had passed away. Since no relative had come forward to claim her, Ophelia had decided to raise her as her own. To Ophelia's surprise, Sarah smiled and told her that she had already known for about a year. She had found out at school but hadn't said anything because, to her, Ophelia was her true mother, and nothing could change that. The two embraced, and Sarah assured Ophelia that she wanted to stay with her forever. Mike eventually regained consciousness, but he was left paralyzed and unable to leave the hospital due to respiratory issues. He spent the rest of his life there, reflecting on the choices that had led him to his current state. Meanwhile, Ophelia continued to raise Sarah, who grew into a beautiful and kind-hearted young woman. Although Ophelia had lost her biological children, she found solace in the love she shared with Sarah. Together, they created a new life, one filled with love, forgiveness, and the healing power of faith. The story illustrates the severe consequences of making certain choices. Mike's decision to betray and neglect his family, favoring his mistresses and abandoning his children in their time of need, led to their tragic deaths and his own downfall. Candice's choice to mock Ophelia, a grieving mother, brought about her own suffering, culminating in a horrifying and fatal encounter with a scorpion, symbolizing the consequences of her cruel actions. Ophelia's initial choice to seek revenge through dark means further compounded her pain and led to more tragedy. However, her eventual decision to embrace love and forgiveness for Sarah allowed her to heal and find peace. The story underscores that actions rooted in cruelty, neglect, and vengeance can lead to devastating outcomes, while choices guided by love and forgiveness can offer redemption and healing. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update on our latest content. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in the next story.